Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. As we continue with our ongoing series that we call Proper Theology, where we look at the character of God, we come again to this common complaint that I've made all along the way, that we have a tendency to talk about God in terms that are profoundly abstract, that we look at a list of qualities that can describe him, a list of adjectives, or a list of nouns, of things that, qualities that he possesses. But we don't spend enough time, in my judgment, pun intended, talking about what he does. That God's self-perception and what should be our perception should include seeing him in light of what he does. So it's not just a question of that God is love, but it is a glorious truth that God does love. And so today, on this particular segment, I'd like us to remember not just that, pun intended, not just that God is just, but that God is a God who judges. It's what he does. I want us to understand that it's not as though when sin entered the world, all of a sudden God had to react to it as if he had to say, oh, I wasn't planning on using this whole judgment thing. I just had it in case, and like a first aid kit in the back of the medicine cabinet. No, this is part and parcel of who he was. And in fact, we see him doing this even before Adam and Eve fell into sin. We see what God is by looking at what God does, even apart from the existence of man itself, let alone the fall of man. How so? Well, when we look through the creation account, we see God acting. God not only acting in space and time, but God creating space and time. But one of the other things that's mentioned over and over again in the creation account is this: God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. This is not an observation that's passive that comes upon us. You know, if you are, this has happened to me, you're let's say it's getting on to time for my sons to come in the house, and I go outside to look for them, and as I'm scanning the area trying to find, where they're playing, I come across a sunset and say, oh my stars, that's a beautiful sunset. That's a sort of accidental discovery, but that's not what's going on here. When God saw that it was good, he saw that because he came to look at that. Now, please don't misunderstand. God's knowledge of all things is immediate. He doesn't have to go study up on things, but he is making an assessment because that's what he does. In fact, you may not know this, but one of the ways that we talk about God's judgment is we speak of the day of the Lord. When the day of the Lord comes. And you remember that there were some in Israel who were looking forward to the day of the Lord. And the prophet said, hey, it's coming. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is it's coming. The bad news is you're not going to like it. It's going to be a day of darkness for you, not a day of deliverance for you. Well, God does come at the day of the Lord, but what I want you to not miss is that this is not just God suits up and comes down to kick butt and take names. But it's God coming to inspect. The image that I think is helpful to understand the day of the Lord is, it's like when the commanding officer shows up for the inspection of the troops. That's what God will be doing. That's what Jesus will be doing when he returns. He will be coming to, as a general, as a military leader, not just coming to get the bad guys, but coming to inspect, coming to judge, coming to assess. And at the end of all time, what happens but this great white throne judgment? I think you can see that this judging thing, it starts at the beginning, it ends at the end, it goes all the way in between, that what we have here is not something secondary to who God is, something outside of his nature and his being. This is what he does. God judges. Now, why is that important for us? Well, first, it should increase our and establish and give deep roots to our gratitude, because we know that God can't escape judging, because it is who he is, and we know that we in ourselves deserve harsh judgment, eternal judgment, but we've been given instead eternal life, which means, secondly, that our redemption, that his declaration of us as righteous, isn't something secondary to him. This is God in his office as judge, when he says to us, because of the work of Christ, because of his death on the cross, because of his life of obedience, he says to us, you are innocent. He's not a bystander. He's not like the Roman soldier who saw Jesus up on the cross and said he was innocent. This is the judge, the God of heaven and earth, declaring to us that we're righteous. We've labored over the series to remember the simplicity of God, that he is one. I want you to see that when God judges us, we receive grace. And when we receive grace, he judges us. I realize that on more than one occasion I've asked you to sit through me reminiscing about one of my teachers from the past in this ongoing segment that we call Heroes You Never Heard Of. It's not been at all unusual. Probably the two most common professions that keep cropping up in these segments are pastors and teachers. Well, I'd like to speak today about another teacher, but this particular teacher was never my teacher. He was that kind of teacher, you know the kind, who has to teach this class or that class in order to qualify to do what he really wants to do, which is to be a coach. I'm speaking today about Dave Hawley. And Dave served for decades at the Wichita Collegiate School, the high school that I attended back in the early to mid 80s. And Dave was the head tennis coach of the school, and the school had a pretty competitive tennis team, though not so competitive that they didn't let me play. But I wouldn't even say that I had him as a coach, because I was so far down the pecking order that, he just let the other players try to help me while he was helping the players who knew what they were doing. But he was also the girls' basketball coach. And the thing that I admire about David Hawley was how incredibly comfortable he was in his own skin. He was a friendly fella. He was not prideful. He would sit down and laugh with you. Just easygoing, but just a remarkable level of peace, especially given the fact that he served as a basketball coach. I mean, what's the point of being a basketball coach if you can't lose your temper? That's what it's all about. Again, while I did play on the tennis team, I obviously didn't play on the girls' basketball team, but I was a manager for the boys' basketball team, and most of the time the two teams traveled together. And so I got to watch Mr. Hawley in action. I got to spend some time with him on bus trips and things like that. And, he was kind. I mean, not in a showy kind of way, not in a, hey, look at me, I'm kind kind of way, just a normal kindness. And it's the kind of kindness that, while it's not showy, we should be noticing. We should be appreciating. I know for a fact that I never once said an encouraging word to Mr. Hawley. In fact, I venture to guess, A, that he doesn't remember me, but B, if he did remember me, that he would be surprised to know that I remembered him. Let alone that I would see him as a hero. But if he did find that out, wouldn't it be something to say to him, the reason you're a hero is because you're just a nice guy. You're just kind. You're easygoing. You don't have some blustery agenda that you're trying to bring to pass. He was quite gifted. He was a very good coach, and the girls' basketball team was very successful. The tennis team, as I mentioned already, was very successful. So he certainly had accolades for winning championships and things like that. But he would have been the same guy if he never won a single game. He did have skills. He was, again, a good coach. But I'm sorry. There's just not a lot to say about it, except he was kind. And it just has me thinking, well, why do we not value that? Why do we not treasure that in a person? Think about the people in your life. Think about the teachers. It's always the teacher that took the kid who was down and out and wasn't going anywhere, but the teacher believed in the kid, and the kid suddenly becomes a great student and ends up getting the big scholarship. Or the teacher just, incites some sort of passion for the subject matter, and becomes a hero for that reason. None of that's true. In fact, I don't even know what Mr. Hawley taught when he wasn't coaching. I know that Coach Bainham taught history. He was the head football coach when I was there. I don't know what Dave Hawley taught. Whatever it was, it wasn't any class that I took. But he was there, and he was a fixture. And he was content. He wasn't looking over his shoulder trying to find the next great gig. Those kind of people. That when you're at an event and they're talking to you, but they're looking over your shoulder to see if there's someone more important than you to talk to. That wasn't what Dave Hawley did. Dave Hawley was invested in whoever he was talking to. He wasn't intense. He wasn't scary. He wasn't, hey, bare your soul. He was just nice. And you could sit and talk about Nebraska football or Wichita State basketball or the newest tennis rackets on the market and enjoy it. Well, once again, I'm going to ask if there's anybody out there that knows Dave Hawley, if you could direct him to this little message. I think it might be an encouragement to him. I'm not sure how old he is. It was quite some time ago that he was there. I'm guessing he's retired, but let him know that one kid at the school where he served all those years, who never had him as a coach, never had him as a teacher, still sees him as a hero to this day. Yesterday, I was blessed to spend about an hour on the phone with a man I'd never met before. He lives in Nampa, Idaho, though he at one time lived right here in Fort Wayne. Homeschooling dad, ordained minister in the Anglican Church of North America, but who has not yet completed any advanced degrees, and he's involved in a program called the Kairos Project, which I'm just learning about. But part of the way this works is it's a push against the sort of academic model of a typical advanced degree program in theology. And in this project, he's required to secure 3 different mentors. One, an academic mentor, because this is not a defense of intellectual laziness, but an academic mentor, a ministerial mentor, and a personal mentor. And we were talking about what role I might play in this project for him. And in the course of that conversation, it got me to thinking again about things that I have written about and talked about in the past, about what's wrong with how we look at the training of men for ministry. And I said to him, I said, isn't it interesting that if you look at the qualifications of an elder in Scripture, you will find that there's roughly 14 of them, and 13 of them are character-based. The one that isn't even necessarily intellect-based, but an elder is supposed to be apt to teach, but the rest of them are issues of character. And so what do? Well, we make sure someone gets through 3 years of academic training so we can be sure he's apt to teach, and the rest we kind of leave by the wayside. And what's ironic is, and I said this to him as well, I said, I spent enough time in seminary, as any seminarian could, to have read through the whole Bible. And one of the things that I discovered in reading through the whole Bible is that it says not the first thing about seminaries. So if a seminary is doing its job, the thing that should happen is the people who are going through it should realize the seminary doesn't even have a job. Well, part of what we want to do with Dunamis Fellowship is help with projects like this, and promote and practice projects like this. Our conviction is that, just like with respect to homeschooling our children, where we would affirm that education is essentially discipleship, the same is true for preparing men for gospel ministry. That's how you see it done in the Bible. Again, I'm not saying anybody's stupid. You can't call Paul stupid, and I'm sure Timothy learned quite a bit at the feet of Paul. But it wasn't given in an academic context. When you step aside from the context of life, you are pushing the faith in an abstract direction. That's not what we want to do. It's not what we want to do at all. And Dunamis Fellowship wants to be in a position where we can help prepare men for ministry, just like the fellow that I was talking to, so that we can talk about character formation. I've said it a million times that the function of the pastor is not to teach the congregation how to live, but to teach the congregation how to confess that none of us live like we should. That the role model, the modeling of the pastor, is not ultimately about how well he does, but it's about how fully, completely, honestly, and openly he repents. Because, friends, that's where the power is. Our whole faith is built on the premise that we're not good. Only Jesus is good, and Jesus is our only hope. I want this message communicated in everything that we do at Dunamis. I want it communicated on our website, rcsproulJR.com. I want it communicated in this podcast. I want it communicated in our Ask RCs. I want it communicated in my podcasty kind of walk through the book of Genesis. Everything that we're doing, I want this message communicated. And I'm asking, as always, for people who are willing to get behind this, to support this, to believe in this. Give it some thought, give it some prayer. Have you thought to yourself, one, why do we do things the way we do? And have you thought to yourself, too, wouldn't it be great if I could have someone who could help mentor me who's been through this? We're looking for support. Will you please consider how you might support the work of Dunamis Fellowship? And as you're doing so, would you pray for us? Would you pray that God would bless us, that God would be pleased to use us, and that he would be pleased to grow his kingdom through our efforts? You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.